Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. We are going to be learning more about the LabVantage Forensic Navigator. My name is Dr. Robin McDonald. I worked as a trace evidence examiner for the Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Laboratory for 14 years. After about 8 years, I was promoted to Criminalist Unit Manager, where I managed at various times the drug chemistry, trace evidence, firearms, and question document units. I also became an ISO 17025 technical assessor in my time with the Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Laboratory. For the past 13 years, I've been working in the LIMS industry as a senior product manager. So I bring my expertise in the forensic field to the company, to LabVantage, directing the development team on how to design the product to meet the needs of the forensic community. At LabVantage, we serve many diverse industries, as you can see here. We have clients in everything from forensics, healthcare, pharma, oil and gas, food and beverage, environmental, and so forth. So we service all of these very diverse and highly regulated industries. Some of our government clients include organizations like NASA, the CDC, Niagara County Sheriff's Office, Forensic Science Ireland, Department of Health in South Dakota. In order to service so many highly regulated organizations across all these many different industries, we have to have a laboratory information management platform that is very rigorous and highly tested. So one might be wondering, why can't forensic laboratories use a generic LIMS? And I will explain. LIMS systems that are not designed for forensics tend to be sample-centric. The nature of the sample will determine what tests need to be run, and those tests will determine what department in the laboratory needs to receive the samples. And that's very different in a crime laboratory. In forensics, everything is case-centric. A crime has been committed, there's a criminal investigation, and under that investigation, there will be packages of evidence. Those packages of evidence will have exhibits. Those exhibits will be tested. Unlike our water sample example, the nature of the exhibit does not necessarily dictate what units of the laboratory are going to test it, nor does it dictate which tests will actually be performed. In this example, we see we have 3 packages of evidence. One is a firearm, the second is a bottle of pills, and the third are some DNA swabs. In package 2, these pills, it's very obvious, they go directly to drug chemistry. The third package, which are the DNA swabs, are going to go to DNA. However, our firearm might need to go to the latent print unit to be printed. It might need to go to DNA and be swabbed for DNA, and ultimately end up in the firearms unit. Also, once it gets to the firearms unit, depending on the scenario, any number of tests may be performed. It might receive operability, serial number restoration. It might be test fired for a comparison in NIBIN. It might be a distance determination or a trigger pull. So this is how forensics is very different and why a generic LIMS is not well suited for the forensic industry, because the generic LIMS are not case-centric. Our LabVantage Forensic Navigator solution covers everything that you're seeing here on the screen. Let's go through them one by one. We have a portal. Everything in our system is web-based, including our portal. Everything's HTML5. You can use various browsers. And so for the portal, this could be your clients logging in through the portal to pre-log their evidence. They can request testing. They could check the status of the work that they've already submitted. They could retrieve copies of the final reports that you've authorized. Also through the portal, as well as through the LIMS, we have some special functionality around sexual assault kit tracking. I'm sure in other countries, as well as here in the US, we have a big problem with the sexual assault kit tracking. And these kits sometimes sit on a shelf for many, many months, even years, before they're submitted to the laboratory and tested. And many of the states in the United States are actually enacting legislation to dictate that these kits be tested within a certain amount of time. So one of the things that we have built into our LIMS is that for sexual assault kits, the survivors can opt in and provide their email address, and they can receive updates when the case passes specific milestones. It could not only be the survivor, but it could be other stakeholders, like maybe a lead detective or a prosecuting attorney. So at key milestones in the life cycle of the evidence, those stakeholders are going to receive an email updating them on the status. We also have crime scene functionality. The crime scene is going to be very different than the portal, whereas the portal pre-logs evidence that's maybe just a traffic stop or something like a nurse submitting a sexual assault kit. Crime scene has to be more rigorous and include a lot of testing, a lot more documentation. So the primary difference is the documentation required at the crime scene is going to be extensive. And we have the ability not only to create a crime scene and document all of the activities that go on for processing that scene, but also to have multiple scenes under one investigation. So for example, if a crime happens at a park, maybe somebody is jogging in the park and they're assaulted, that would be one crime scene. But the police may also need to go to the hospital and collect some evidence from that victim. They also may get a lead to a suspect and they might need to go to that person's home and collect evidence. So whatever the scenario is, under that one investigation, we can create multiple different geographic scenes and assign different detectives to process each of those scenes. We also have a narrative. So as the crime scene detectives are doing their work, they can be simply typing or dictating into a large space, free texting. They can document the exhibits they're collecting, all of this with the complete chain of custody, and ultimately write their crime scene report. Once the evidence moves on to the laboratory, the evidence will come in through an evidence intake unit or central receiving unit. The work will be assigned by managers. So once in central receiving, someone's going to say this package of evidence needs to be worked on by DNA or drugs or firearms or some combination. The supervisors of those units will be alerted to the fact that there are new packages of evidence that need to be examined by their unit. They can then assign the work. The analysts will do chain of custody transactions. The analysts will assign the work. They will write reports. The reports will be reviewed. Evidence will be stored when it's not in the possession of one of the examiners. We also support all of the quality assurance activities that go along with the testing of the evidence. We can link cases one to another. We also can track the results of APHIS, CODIS, and NIBIN searches. And we do cover all disciplines that you see here, as well as others. Another part of our solution is for the medical examiner offices. So these would be people who are responsible for body intake, autopsies, determining cause of death, doing pathology analyses, notifying next of kin, and documenting personal effects. And under all of this forensic functionality, as I mentioned earlier, is our core LIMS that supports all of those different industries that we saw earlier. Also, our core LIMS has been around for about 40 years. So 40 years of experience supporting regulated industries across the globe makes it a very rigorous, solid product. And on top of that now, what we've added is a layer of configuration that permits forensic laboratories to take advantage of this without needing to customize the system. We've already added these workflows, the case centricity, and chain of custody, and things that are important to forensics. Some of those general laboratory features that we would expect all laboratories to need would be things like corrective action, monitoring your equipment and all of your preventative and maintenance, documenting all of the consumables that you use with expiration dates and quality testing, having analytical dashboards, control charts. All of that stuff is just good laboratory practice. So looking at the law enforcement ecosystem, any given forensic organization might consist of everything that you see on the left, or some portion thereof. At a minimum, we're looking at a laboratory. Your organization may also include a property warehouse where property is stored when it's not being tested. You may also be affiliated with a medical examiner's office. You might have a crime scene unit, and certainly you have law enforcement officers who are going to be submitting evidence either with or without the use of the portal. So the medical examiner, crime scene unit, and these law enforcement officers are all sources of evidence that could come into either your property room or the laboratory or both. And certainly evidence can move around all of these different areas. As an organization, you may also be servicing other organizations, such as other police departments that are not part of your own law enforcement organization. You may also be working with a hospital or a sexual assault treatment center. You might be working with prosecuting attorneys, other medical examiners, and you may also be sometimes outsourcing some of your work to other laboratories. And our LabVantage Forensic Navigator supports this entire structure that you see here on the screen, the entire law enforcement ecosystem. So looking at the typical laboratory process for a forensic laboratory, typically the evidence starts out in a central receiving area. The evidence will come into that central receiving area in a number of ways. Either a law enforcement officer will walk through the door with the evidence, and the person working in central receiving will need to do all of the documentation within the LIMS of the details of that case. The evidence may have been pre-logged in the portal, as we mentioned, in which case all of the data that's already been documented in the portal will be imported into the LIMS. The evidence may come from the medical examiner, or it could also originate from a crime scene unit. So these are all sources of evidence entering the laboratory. Once the evidence has entered the laboratory, someone will look at those packages of evidence and look at the requests that are being made and say, what area do these different packages need to go to? And once that has been determined and indicated in the LIMS, that unit, such as firearms, latent prints, drug chemistry, question documents, whatever unit needs to work on those packages, will see that new work has arrived, and they will then be able to assign that work. Alternatively, some organizations choose to allow the examiners in a specific unit to self-assign the work. So as we go through the presentation today, and I'm talking about who performs these various activities, understand that the system is completely configurable, and you can decide in your organization what job type can do these various activities. And it doesn't have to be the same across your entire organization. If in the firearms unit, you want to allow the examiners to self-assign, as an example, but in the drug unit, you want the supervisor to do the assignments, All of that is possible. Everything is highly configurable without the need to write code. So once the supervisor sees the work that's come into their unit, they can assign that work out. The analyst then can see that they've been assigned new work. They can retrieve that evidence, doing, chain of custody being tracked throughout this entire process. They will assign tests to the evidence. They will enter their results and ultimately write a report. When I say enter results, that could be entering the results manually, or it could also be through an instrument interface. Some areas of the laboratory are well suited to manual entry, like firearms examinations, question document examinations. However, other areas of the laboratory can really benefit from instrument interfaces, such as toxicology and drug chemistry, interfacing with GC mass specs. Also in DNA, interfacing to the quant instruments as well as the typing instruments. All of that is something that we readily support. You'll notice that I put assign tests in blue. And the reason I did that is because that is where there's often some differences in the workflow. So if we're talking about areas of the laboratory such as drug chemistry, firearms, question documents, digital evidence, in those areas, the typical workflow is that an examiner is assigned to work on the evidence in their unit. That one person will assign the test, they will enter their results, and they will ultimately write the report. In other areas of the laboratory, such as toxicology, there's more of a team-based approach, and we fully support that team-based approach too, where maybe a senior examiner is assigning the test. There may be a technician who's looking at what tests need to be performed on the samples and taking aliquots, and there may be another scientist who's actually responsible for performing the tests and entering the data. So we support that team-based approach. In addition to that, when we're talking about DNA, that is more of a plate-based workflow, where we're going to be loading up maybe a 96-well plate, and we fully support that as well. And then the last thing I think that's a little bit different is latent prints needs to have a little bit of special consideration for data entry, because in addition to doing their routine work, at the end of the day, they're going to be performing comparisons between people and the impressions that they've developed. Once the examiner is done writing their report and it's gone through a review process, they're going to be returning their evidence back to central receiving typically. And then from there, the evidence will usually be returned back to the submitting agency or sent over to a property room for long-term storage. So looking at the forensic menu in the LabVantage Forensic Navigator, this is the forensic menu that you're seeing on the screen. And behind that, as I mentioned, we have our core LIMS product, where we have menus that would be used by people like your system administrator, your LIMS administrator, a laboratory power user, or a laboratory administrator. So things like setting up the test methods, creating the users, creating the different units within your laboratory, adding the instruments and the consumables and all of that sort of stuff that every laboratory needs to do, that would be under a different menu. So what you're seeing here is just the specific functionality for the Forensic Navigator. The other thing I want to mention here is that not everybody is going to see everything that you're seeing on the screen right now. Our system is job-based, or based on your job type, I should say, will determine what you're actually seeing on the screen. And you're going to see maybe some examples of that as we go through. I'll point some of that out. But if I'm working in the central receiving unit, I'm going to see things like the request management, case management, but I don't need to see things about assigning work and writing reports. I don't need to see things like about the forensic searches. If I work in the DNA unit, I only need to see under forensic searches, I only need to see the CODIS stuff. I don't need to see the APHIS and NIBIN stuff. You'll see we have some special functionality for latent prints here around the comparisons, as well as some special functionality for DNA, including that plate-based workflow, as well as managing the DNA profiles. In addition to our forensic menu, we also have a special menu for the medical examiner offices because they are dealing with the decedents or patients, maybe funeral homes. Also, they are doing activities such as body intake, autopsies, and pathology, and all of this in both systems with full chain of custody tracking. Okay. So let's take a moment and just have a look at some of our portal screens. When one of your clients or one of your submitters logs into the portal, they can see a dashboard that shows all of their records that they're working on, the ones that are in draft status, the ones that are pending acceptance, the ones that are already being worked on in the laboratory. They can communicate back and forth with the laboratory. This is just one example of a screen, and it's important to understand that for all of the screens that you will see, they are all highly configurable. We have a web page designer that allows these screens to be readily modified for a specific client. If I want to go, if I click, let's go back 1 second. If I clicked on my orange bar there, the draft records, I come in here, I can see that in the background there, I can see those 4 specific records. If I wanted to create a new submission, I would just click that red plus button over on the far right, and I can add a new request. And you can kind of see what those screens might look like. And again, they're modifiable. Here we can see on my screen, I would document, for example, what it already knows what agency I work for, what department I belong to. I would put in my agency case ID. So this is that very important number that identifies that criminal case. You'll see down in the next box, there's a little red triangle. Based on the agency that I work for and my agency case ID, if there are other, if I have already submitted work under the same case in the past, because we all know evidence is developed sometimes over time, I would be notified there if it matches a case that we already have in the system. Otherwise, it will generate a case ID for me, a laboratory case ID. And some other things we would document would be what type of case is it? What is the offense that this person is being charged with? What crime did they commit? What lab testing site am I sending this evidence to? If it's only one laboratory that you work with, then you wouldn't have to select that. That's something that we would default. I can put an incident summary. You'll notice the little red stars. Those little red stars indicate that that is a required field. So for every organization that we work with you to decide what do I need to capture and what things do I want to make mandatory. The next important screen, once we would be saving this information, would be to document the packages of evidence and the exhibits. So you see these, again, these little red plus signs. I can add packages, and then I can indicate down below what is inside the package. Once I've documented what evidence is inside the package, on the bottom right, you can see a column called Forensic Services. That's where I can indicate to the laboratory using a drop-down menu, what am I requesting the lab to do with this evidence? Okay. And here you can see one of these examples filled out. So I can see at the top here, we have a request ID that's now been assigned to this submission. We have our agency and agency case ID. We see our packages. I have package ending in number 2 and a package ending in number 3. Package number 2 is a tape-sealed paper bag. The other package is a sexual assault kit, which by default then allows us to put in an identifier because some of these kits are purchased from a manufacturer and have their own identifier. We can indicate who the impounding and submitting officers are. Again, if this is not information you normally document, you don't have to have all of that. Down below, we can see that we have 2 exhibits. We have some clothing in package number 2 and a sexual assault kit in package number 3. And on the far right, we can see the testing that's being requested of the laboratory. The next step in the workflow would be that the evidence ultimately is going to end up over in the central receiving unit of the laboratory. So this is one of those examples that I mentioned. Depending on your job at the organization, it will limit what you're seeing. So the central receiving person might have a screen that looks similar to what you see here. And if the evidence had not already been pre-logged, they would click receive evidence, and then they would be able to document all of that same type of information that we just saw. However, if the evidence is coming in from a portal request, they would actually click the button on the left that says portal request pending acceptance. And if they do that, all of that information that's already been populated will be imported into the system. So depending on which route they go, either the information you see on the screen would either be imported automatically, or it would be typed in manually if this had not already been pre-logged, or if it had not come from a crime scene. So the information you see here is very similar to what we just saw on the other screen. You'll notice at the bottom we do have several other tabs. I didn't show you all of this in the portal, but in the portal we also do document things like the persons involved, suspects, victims, things like that. In addition, you can see here in the middle part of the screen, we have linked cases. So we can link this case to other cases at any point during the workflow. We can add attachments. Ultimately, we will see our examiner report showing up here. So this record is in an area we call case management. And think of case management as your electronic filing cabinet. And when you want to look up a case, I'm not showing you the screen here, but you would simply enter some information. You can search for cases by a variety of different pieces of information. And when you find that record, you open it, and it would be like opening the manila folder in a paper-based system. It's like when we come into this screen, we're opening the manila folder, and we see all of the information about the case in here. And of course, we only can see what our role and our job permits us to see. Chain of custody is a very important part of forensic systems. And for LIMS products that are not designed for the forensic industry, this is a significant challenge. In working with clients all over the world, what we've seen is when people try to use a non-forensic focused LIMS, and they have to build this chain of custody functionality, it's very time consuming and it's very risky. In our system, you can do basically 4 different types of chain of custody transactions. I'm only showing one of them on the screen, but you could transfer evidence to a secure location, which would require the person to put their username and password. Can transfer evidence from a secure location, which also requires a username and password. Or you can transfer evidence from one person to another, and that's what you're seeing on the screen. You can see on the far left, we have this package of evidence, package ID ending in 18, and we can see that it's in the custody of Craig Kelly. Craig wants to transfer that evidence to Rose Carter. You can see in the column to the left of Craig Kelly's name, it says package currently assigned to. Rose wants to get this evidence and start working on it. So Craig is going to select that package. We could also use barcode scanning. You can see the little barcode icon right up above where it says case ID. Craig clicks transfer to user. Craig puts in his username and password, and Rose puts in her username and password. And now you can see in the screen on the far right that the current custodian is Rose Carter. I said that there are 4 types of chain of custody transactions. The 4th one, which the person logged in this screen does not have access to, is taking custody as a supervisor. And that's for the situation where the evidence is in someone's custody and maybe they become ill, or for some reason they can't come in to the office, and you need to get custody of that package and give it to someone else. So we do have a chain of custody transfer by supervisor, which allows the supervisor to force custody into their possession, and then they can give it to the appropriate person. Okay. As I mentioned, once the work comes into the laboratory, someone is going to indicate what units of the laboratory need to work on that evidence. And once that has been done, when one of those supervisors logs into the LIMS, they will see on their screen, under pending assignments, they will see the new work. So this is a screen that a supervisor might see where they are having access to things like case management, as well as assignments and reports, package management, chain of custody. This person's a supervisor in DNA, so you can see they have all of the forensic search options there for CODIS, and then also there's specific DNA workflow. So as a supervisor, any unit, they can go into pending assignments. And again, this could be an examiner that is given permission to access that pending assignments link. When we go into pending assignments, they're going to see all of the work that needs to be assigned in their unit. They can select one of the packages, or they can select multiple packages. And then they would click the Assign Package button. It would show them a list of all of the people who work in their unit, as well as the current workload. And then they could choose what examiner do they want to work on this new, these new packages. Some other information you can see on this screen, if we look across, we can see kind of there to the right a little bit, the case priority. That's inherited from the case. But for each testing laboratory, like DNA, firearms, latent prints, each different testing lab can have their own priority as well, because something that's a rush case for firearms might not be a rush case for the drug unit. You can see on the far right that some of the records have a little icon that shows a person. If that case has ever been worked in the laboratory before, we will see that little icon, and clicking on it will show you who has worked on this case in the past, because in a given unit, you will likely want to keep the same examiner working on that case so that when it goes to trial, you don't have multiple examiners out at the same time. Once you've assigned that work to an examiner, and that examiner becomes aware that they have new work and they take possession of that evidence. And again, I am not showing you every single screen. So if we just go back for 1 second here, you'll notice under unit casework, we had pending assignments, current assignments, which is where you could change the assignments, and then manage assignments. Manage assignment is where the analyst can go to see their current workload. So that's how they would know that they have new work assigned to them. They would then go get the evidence from either a secure location or central receiving using chain of custody transactions. And once it's in their possession, now they can add testing to that. Okay. So as an examiner, I can see all of the evidence that I have in my possession. Here I'm seeing on the left the packages as well as the exhibits that are inside those packages. Notice I can create sub-exhibits or child exhibits if I need to. In this example, we see under the firearm, we see 2 sub-exhibits. We see exhibit 1 is the firearm, 1.1 is a magazine that was taken out of the firearm, and 1.1.1 is a cartridge that was removed from the magazine. I can select any of my exhibits or even multiple exhibits. I then can come over here and say Add Test. When I click Add Test, it's going to present me with a menu of all of the tests that we conduct in my specific area of expertise. And we can simply check mark the test that we want to perform on this specific exhibit. You can see some other things here at the top of the screen, like import a file. So for units that are using instrument interfaces, we can either manually import data, or this can all be done in the background. So if this were a drug unit, they might have it set up that in the background, when the results come off of the instrument, it's already going to be associated to the exhibit. Okay. From the previous screen, I should say, we saw here that we could add the test, but once we add the test, we can then click this button that says data entry to actually enter our results. And this is just one example. You can see the larger screen in the background shows my exhibit, exhibit 1, and we can see that I have a couple of different tests added to it. The first test is this weapons worksheet, and these, under the parameter column, are all of the different observations that I'm making. The way we enter the data is configurable. It could be free text, it could be a time date stamp, an electronic signature, it can be a large free text, it could be a drop down. In this example under the make, you'll notice that I have a little square with an arrow beside it. That's because if I don't know what the make is, if I want to click there, it can open and show me a library and I can click on it, or I can simply just start typing it. But you can also, like I said, have drop downs that are simple yes, no, not applicable, or we could open up an entire menu that you can search and add those into those fields. We also have the ability to not only see data entry in a grid fashion like you're seeing here. So think of these as your electronic worksheets where you're documenting all of the results of your testing. But we also have something called laboratory execution sheets, or LES, which is a different presentation and allows you to enter your data in more of like a notebook fashion. So that's another option you would have. As I mentioned, DNA kind of has its own special workflow. So you can see on my screen here, I've chosen this one labeled FRN_ full DNA extraction by array. You can have as many of these different workflows as you want. Also, please understand that under each step in the workflow, you can have multiple different options. So for example, this is a very typical extraction, quant, amp, and typing DNA workflow. Under extraction, I can actually have several different extraction techniques. You might have 5 different extraction techniques. And another thing to point out is that the little red circles show you how many samples are in that specific step at this moment. And so when we come into extraction as an example and say start task, we would select which of those 21 samples we want to take through the extraction process. We would choose our extraction process and go on from there. All of the equipment, all of the consumables you're using, all of that is going to be traced as well. Now, there's a lot of arrows on this screen, and that's important because, as we know, things might not always take the same path through the process. So maybe from extraction, we might go into quantification. And from quant, depending on those quant results, we might send the samples straight to amplification or over to the typing step. So we can skip steps. We've built in a review step at each point so that you can make those kind of decisions. You'll also note for quant and typing, we have this extra box that says import, and that's because these are situations where you would be exporting a file or a run list out to the instrument and then re-importing the data once it's complete and then reviewing that data. So those instrument interfaces can be built right into the workflow. This is just one example of what it looks like under one of those steps. So for example, for this quant step, we see here I have some unknowns on the left. I would load those unknowns into the plate on the right. You'll notice the blue, teal, and yellow. That's where I can go to add either A, my unknowns, and B, my standards or quality checks in yellow. That would change the list on the left, and I would add my quality checks. And then treatment, that would be things like my buffers and master mix, things like that, that I would be able to populate into all of the wells. So all of that stuff is managed here. This is kind of blowing it up a little bit so you can see better. You can see here that I've added these 3 samples into the plate. The number 1 in blue indicates that there's only 1 component in those wells at this moment. But if I were to click on the teal treatment button and then choose a buffer, I would multi-select these samples and load the buffer into those wells as also. So through this whole entire process, it goes step by step, and you can either choose to keep all of the samples together on one plate, or you can also, at each step, choose samples from different plates in a previous step. So it allows it to be very efficient as you go through the process. Latent prints needs some special functionality because we all know that on a given lift card, we might have multiple impressions, as I've shown here on the right. Impression, I've just labeled them A and B here. So as I'm doing some friction ridge analysis work on a lift card, I would want to be able to create impressions, and that's what you see down below. The top portion, I'm looking at basically observations that apply to the lift card itself, whereas down below, I'm performing a more detailed impression analysis on impression A and impression B. So again, the system's very configurable and flexible to account for all of these different scenarios. Also in latent prints, if you'll look at the bottom of the screen, we need the ability to ultimately do comparisons. So we can see here that I had one suspect, Mitchell Grimes, but I had two impressions. I had actually, it was two different exhibits, exhibit 1 and exhibit 2 in this case, exhibit 1 and exhibit 2. So I want to compare the impressions from exhibit 1 and the impressions from exhibit 2 back to Mitchell Grimes. Now, this screen you're seeing is actually a little further down in the workflow. The analyst has entered their result here, unclear palm print for number 1 and right palm for the second one. What you're also seeing on this screen is that the verifier came up with a different result. So after the analyst completed their work, this record was sent over for another person to review. And this is just kind of a silly example. I put left foot for both of these just to illustrate the point that this person has a different result from the original analyst. In a situation like that, everybody's going to be notified and they have to come together to enter a final result. So we can handle these kind of discrepancies, and they come together, they make the final result, and then they would hit reconcile verification at the top, and both parties would put in their username and password to indicate that they've come to an agreement. Toxicology has also some different workflows. You can see here a couple screens for toxicology where someone can choose what test or what test panel is going to be added. Someone can see here on the right, we can see all the samples once they're received their test assignments. They can see all of the samples that need to have a specific test. Someone can view the sampling plan. They can see if it requires aliquots. They can see how many aliquots are required. And then ultimately, those samples can be batched and run on the instrument. See this batch process here. If I were to select this blood alcohol batch, it would then present me with a list of all samples that require blood alcohol, and I can select the ones that I want to run as part of that batch. If you were to go to our website, you can get a lot more information about the Forensic Navigator there, including some videos, some webinar links, some papers that we've written, several blog posts. So I would encourage you, if you would like some more information, to go to our website and check that out. And at this point, I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you all for your time.